For all of recorded history, anyone seeking access to the vast, untapped riches of the Arctic has faced one key obstacle: ice. But the frozen North is no longer quite so frozen. As the polar ice cap retreats, the Arctic is becoming a focus for economic development and geopolitical rivalry. Great Decisions investigates the ambitions of Arctic powers, both old and new, and asks whether a spirit of cooperation can endure in one of the Earth's most inhospitable regions. The fight over the melting Arctic. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
The old mariners fought for the Northwest Passage because they believed it would prove a short commercial route between the East and the West. The route which Amundsen has located will be of considerable use to whalers, but it is unlikely that anything else will come of it. National Geographic Magazine, 1906.
By the time the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen completed the first transit of the Northwest Passage, it was widely understood that Arctic shipping routes offered no commercial value. But now, more than a century later, the Arctic is changing.
In 2019, Anchorage, Alaska experienced the highest recorded temperature in the history of their state. If there's any pretense about us being in denial about climate change, all they have to do is look to Anchorage and understand that it's the honest-to-God truth.
In July of 2020, Arctic sea ice cover hit its lowest ever recorded level. Scientists are predicting in the next decade or so, we may start to see some ice-free summers.
Climate change is going to impact the Arctic and it's going to impact the conditions of navigation. It could shorten the trip from Asia to Europe. If instead of taking the south route, you could go north along Russia.
In 2016, the Crystal Serenity cruise ship became the largest passenger vessel to sail through the Northwest Passage. It sailed from Vancouver to New York. We're at the beginning of what we can anticipate will be an increase in shipping into the high latitudes.
The melting of Arctic ice is making it easier than ever to access the region's untapped mineral wealth.
Ice melting has both positive and negative consequences. Access to the hydrocarbons and other mineral resources and bioresources in the Arctic is expanding.
13% of the world's undiscovered conventional oil resources reside in the Arctic. 30% of the undiscovered natural gas, nearly $1 trillion worth of minerals, including gold and gem-quality diamonds.
Geopolitical strategists around the world have taken note of the Arctic's new possibilities. Today, many countries are working to expand their influence at the top of the world.
The heightened interest in the Arctic has brought China and Russia together. As Russia and China become more active in the region, the US has realized that it needs to increase its engagement.
The region has become an arena for power and for competition. And the 8 Arctic states must adapt to this new future.
During the Cold War, the Arctic became a battleground as the US and the Soviet Union faced off across the pole.
What was once the impassable Arctic now provides the quickest routes for attack from a wide sector of Europe and Asia.
Geopolitical competition is going to become a more dominant feature of the Arctic. And this is also an area that the United States has somewhat neglected over the past few years.
When we thought the threat of over-the-pole ballistic missile attacks had ended, we were premature in our view that competition in the Arctic had diminished. And I think we will now pay a price for having to hurry to catch up.
Ура!
Президент Российской Федерации Владимир Путин.
Vladimir Putin has quietly worked to strengthen Russia's strategic position in the Arctic to a level not seen since the Cold War.
The Russian president has very clearly explained that one of his main goals for Russia's Arctic policy is to develop the northern sea routes. It would mean upgrading a lot of transport infrastructure, port infrastructure, and so on.
They're not messing around. They understand the value of the Arctic. They're establishing bases and activity up there, natural resource extraction.
They have the most modernized strategic and nuclear submarines very close to Norway, but they have a bigger strategic ambition. And that, I would say, is mainly the strategic competition between Russia and the United States.
We are strengthening scientific, transport, navigation, and military infrastructure, which will allow us to secure Russia's interests in this strategically important region.
Some experts contend that Russia's military buildup should not be seen as a provocation.
Former Soviet facilities are being opened back up. They're building out additional infrastructure there, modern infrastructure. They're putting in longer runways. But a lot of what I have seen and what I've heard is that it's defensive in orientation.
Well, you could ask me if I'm concerned. I'm not. I think if that is a threat to anyone, it's a threat to the polar bears primarily. There's a need to have some sort of security presence in that enormous space.
Russia, perpetually strapped for cash, has been forced to turn for help to the newest player in the region, China.
After 2014 and the Western sanctions on Russia following Crimea annexation, Russia had no other choice than to turn toward China and accept Chinese investment. Russia and China are cooperating quite closely on the Yamal liquid natural gas project.
Yamal Peninsula is in the Russian high north. It has a large natural gas reserve, but Russia for a very long time has not had the ability to explore that natural gas because it requires large amount of financial capital.
Although Russia and China have cooperated effectively on oil and gas exploration, experts caution that the two countries' interests in the Arctic do not always align.
On the one hand, China is perceived by Russia as a promising partner in the Arctic. But on the other hand, the Sino-Russian relationship in the Arctic is sort of a marriage of convenience. Russia has no illusions about Chinese interests.
Russia strongly identifies as an Arctic state and would be
unwilling to countenance a partnership with China where it's no longer the leader in that region. I think China is mindful of that, has tread cautiously with Russia in the Arctic.
As China has ramped up its investment around the world, the Arctic has become part of its global strategy.
China has integrated the Arctic in its Belt and Road Initiative, calling it the Polar Silk Road. And the idea is to build infrastructure to be able to use the region as a shipping route.
The 2018 Arctic White Paper by China states what national interest China sees for itself in the Arctic. Chinese are quite clear that they have an economic interest in the Arctic, and they have interest in the governance issue in the Arctic because the changes in the Arctic region has a global impact.
Chinese companies have sought investment opportunities in every Arctic country. But to local officials wary of China's ambitions, such investment is not always welcome.
China will use the same methods that it has done in the rest of the world to promote a Chinese agenda that is not just about making money, but it's also about establishing a strategic foothold.
China's actions in Greenland have been very controversial. Chinese construction companies bid to renovate 3 airports, and that elicited concern in the United States. And Secretary of State Pompeo approached Denmark to warn them against this.
I think we should pay attention to anything that is a precursor to military presence in the Arctic. Investment in Greenland's airport for tourism, benign. Investment in Greenland's airport where you might ultimately control that as a base, not benign.
For many years, China controversially sought membership in the Arctic Council, an intergovernmental forum for the 8 Arctic countries to discuss common issues. In 2013, China finally earned observer status within the council.
China has successfully got itself into the room of the Arctic Council, but it does not yet have a seat at the table. So that actually has created quite a lot of frustration in China about its Arctic policy.
Many years ago, we kind of had the Arctic to ourselves, but the latest development is that also non-Arctic states are very eager to take part in I think what they see as an Arctic adventure.
One of China's arguments is that because climate change in the Arctic is a threat multiplier, it affects China as well as Arctic states. But Arctic states claim that they are the stewards of the region and other states outside it should play by their rules.
American policymakers have taken an especially dim view of China's interest in the Arctic. In May 2019, at the Arctic Council ministerial meeting, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo castigated Beijing for its behavior in the region.
There are only Arctic states and non-Arctic states. No third category exists, and claiming otherwise entitles China to exactly nothing.
Being there in the audience in that very speech, it was rather strange. There has been some sort of agreement that this is for functional cooperation. So let's keep it like that.
The criticisms and accusations made by individuals on the American side regarding China's involvement in Arctic affairs are completely inconsistent with the facts. Moreover, they are contrary to the general trend of peaceful cooperation in the Arctic.
Mike Pompeo placed the Arctic in the context of great power competition, which was also unusual for the Arctic Council because the Arctic Council does not deal with security issues.
In Mike Pompeo's defense, Anytime you try to ignore reality for collegiality, you'll lose collegiality more permanently. It's very important that we recognize that our challenges with China and our challenges with Russia, we can't pretend they don't exist.
In 2019, an unusual proposal brought the Trump administration's Arctic strategy to the top of the nightly news.
The Wall Street Journal is reporting today that President Donald Trump and his senior advisors have floated the idea of purchasing Greenland. Officials from Greenland, which is an autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark, have responded by publicly declaring that their island is not for sale.
Although the plan to buy Greenland was swiftly dismissed, American policymakers are paying more and more attention to the Earth's largest island.
The U.S. has opened a consulate in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, in May 2020.
It's a statement of America's commitment to the Arctic as non-Arctic states look to exploit the region for their own interests, as I warned of back at the Arctic Council.
The U.S. has also approved of a minor aid package to Greenland. That's for purposes such as economic development, so that Greenland, for example, can start making money on tourism. That was one of the areas where China was interested in investing.
I think a lot of people don't know that we have an air base up in Greenland, the very tip top. I've been there a couple of times. Our facilities in Greenland, they're the pickets. They are the eyes and ears for the U.S., watching for threats coming from the east.
In Alaska, experts are sounding the alarm about the lack of American infrastructure in Arctic waters. The U.S., they say, is not prepared for the coming surge of shipping.
It reminds me of the stories of the early Arctic explorers, many of whom were, of course, rescued by Inuit. We will be, in all likelihood, the first responders because of the lack of infrastructure and availability of response services throughout the Arctic.
We're going to need icebreaker capacity to be available. We're going to need more Coast Guard investment. They need a full base on the western coast of Alaska that's fully operational and available.
In April of 2019, the Navy and Coast Guard awarded a contract to VT Halter Marine for the detailed design and construction of a polar security cutter. When we think about our maritime national security objectives and the need to support economic and commercial and our scientific interests, it's just critical that we begin to field these polar security cutters.
Fundamental to U.S. Arctic policy is the question of how to balance the Arctic's economic potential with global climate concerns.
For security purposes alone, the United States shouldn't be holding back on its oil and gas production capability. What we don't produce, the Saudis will, the Russians will, the Venezuelans will, and I believe it's very important for the United States to be a player in the global energy market.
We've already discovered enough fossil fuel reserves to push us beyond the safe level of warming that was agreed to in the Paris Climate Accords. Opening up new areas like the Arctic is completely inconsistent with limiting climate change to a safe level.
Now, policymakers must decide whether it is wise for the U.S. to spend the billions of dollars that would be required to turn the Arctic into a geopolitical battleground.
It's very expensive, both to build and to maintain. But if the United States is committed to this competition with China and with Russia, and if we believe that the Arctic is a worthwhile domain of that competition, this is the kind of investments that are necessary for us to be able to sustain that kind of intense engagement that's going to be required.
What we need is not competition. What we need is collaboration. It's a lot easier to work on the assumption that competition is inevitable, and therefore to funnel yet more money to the Navy and to the Air Force so that they can undertake this militarization of the Arctic. I think that would be a large mistake.
When the Arctic Council was founded in 1996, its members agreed to use the forum to discuss environmental and cultural issues rather than security.
The Arctic Council has as its primary objective to promote cooperation, coordination and interaction between the Arctic states and the Arctic inhabitants. It is explicitly stated that the Arctic Council is not dealing with military security. It's probably one of the main contributing factors to the Arctic Council being able to continue to operate, I would say, relatively unimpeded.
It has now a heavy emphasis on sort of climate change, environmental issues, practical economic cooperation between the participating states. I don't see that as changing. Security issues, I think, will be fairly difficult to bring into it.
Although the Arctic Council members had long cooperated on environmental issues, climate change became an unprecedented sticking point at the Council's 2019 summit in Finland.
In May 2019, the Arctic Council meeting was the first time that there was not a common declaration that was adopted at the end. And the main reason was that the United States did not want climate change to be mentioned.
We didn't sign today the Arctic Declaration. It is clear that the climate issues are different from the different viewpoints and from the different capitals.
Arctic Council ministerial meeting in Rovaniemi, Finland in May 2019 displayed that there are some new challenges. And the indigenous peoples organizations definitely expressed our concerns about that, as climate change is a major concern for us.
Some experts believe that if the Arctic Council is to remain collegial, it may be necessary to find a new forum to encourage dialogue between the US and its strategic rivals.
NATO allies and Russia, they have a body called the NATO-Russia Council. That's where the NATO allies discuss security and defense with Russia, and that should be the place where we continue to go discuss these issues.
What we need to do is to be able to meet those nations with military forces up there and talk about confidence building measures. Talk about other ways that we can avoid surprising each other with military deployments. I would use a fora that's not set up yet, but I would use one that is not the Arctic Council.
Because the capitals of all 8 Arctic nations lie below the Arctic Circle, it will be essential for policymakers to listen to those who live in the region.
What I learned at being in the Senate is their inability to understand on the ground what's going on is pretty high. They don't live there. They don't live in a community that's 30 below. If the local communities in the state are not engaged, then it will be, in my view, a long-term disaster for the area.
If one recognizes that every matter in the Arctic region is interrelated, then the issues of security, militarization, stability, and all of the related matters concern us, concern the people who rely upon this environment.
Despite rising geopolitical tensions, the people who live in the Arctic are confident that the connections between neighbors will remain stronger than the forces of division.
Our fear is that if there is an increased militarization of the areas, that the opportunities and the possibilities for us as one people to interact could be affected. But we also put a lot of confidence in the Arctic Council and that body for being an arena for discussion and dialogue between neighbors.
Residents of the Arctic have long shared bonds that transcend national boundaries, forged by the common experience of life in a severe environment. Now, Those bonds are being tested as the Earth's great powers turn their attention toward the top of the world.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.